and as a young woman, seeing Justice Jackson on the Supreme Court is invigorating, truly. And on Tuesday, it baffled me that you would ask such flagrantly racist questions to this exceedingly well-qualified candidate.
A student stood up, looked Ted Cruz in the eye, and accused him of asking flagrantly racist questions during a Supreme Court hearing. Most politicians would have snapped back instantly, but Cruz stayed calm, smiled, and responded with a history lesson that completely shifted the room. Instead of arguing emotionally, Cruz praised Justice Jackson, acknowledged her achievements, then turned the conversation towards something nobody expected. Clarence Thomas, Janice Rogers Brown, and who actually gets called racist in Washington. What happened next exposed a debate far bigger than one Supreme Court nominee.
Justice Jackson. Since you're here tonight, though, in the name of fostering intellectual diversity in academic spaces, it would appear to me that you already recognize the importance of new perspectives, and as a young woman, seeing Justice Jackson on the Supreme Court is invigorating, truly. And on Tuesday, it baffled me that you would ask such flagrantly racist questions to this exceedingly well-qualified candidate. Your colleagues in the GOP promised a respectful and dignified hearing for Justice Jackson, and to me, you did not uphold this. So today I wanted to create a space where you might be able to challenge your own thinking, as prudent scholars often do. So I'm here to ask you, what are two nice comments you can give about recent nominee Justice Jackson's judicial experience, besides from she has an easy smile?
Yeah, you racist. What's the comment? Well, let me start by thanking you for being here. And thank you for asking a substantive, important question. Thank you for engaging in a conversation. I think we all would be better off if we engage in substantive conversations. There's a lot to praise about Judge Jackson. She is very, very bright. She is very, very accomplished. She is very talented. She has an impressive and inspiring personal story. I will say, sitting listening to her opening remarks, where she described her personal story, she described her parents' journey. You had to be dead not to be inspired by that journey. And listen, I will say more broadly, if you look at the history of our country, if you look at the history of our country on race, it is absolutely inspiring to see an African-American woman serving on the Supreme Court. I will also point out that when it comes to issues of race, I think both the press and the modern left are hypocritical on this question. That they only define someone as black, or they only define someone as Hispanic, if they agree with them ideologically. So, Clarence Thomas has been on the court for decades. Clarence Thomas is a black man. The left hates him. They despise Clarence Thomas. And I'll tell you, by the way, the treatment of Clarence Thomas on the left is markedly different than, say, Antonin Scalia. Antonin Scalia was brilliant. He and Justice Thomas were every bit as conservative. And yet, the vitriol that was heaped on Clarence Thomas, nasty, racist language from the left. There was one magazine cover that showed Clarence Thomas as an Uncle Tom sitting at Scalia's feet. I think was racist and disgusting. And listen, I will say this as an Hispanic man. As an Hispanic man, Jorge Ramos went on television in Spanish and described me as a traitor to my race for daring. Okay, look, that says something about the view of the left, that they're telling you you have one way to view things and one way only. And if you don't, we'll demonize and attack you. So look, and by the way, in terms of having the first African-American woman on the Supreme Court, there was an opportunity for this to happen 20 years ago. There's a judge named Janice Rogers Brown. Janice Rogers Brown was a Supreme Court justice on the California Supreme Court. George W. Bush nominated Janice Rogers Brown to the D.C. Circuit. At the beginning of his presidency, he nominated Judge Brown to the D.C. Circuit. The Democrats filibustered Judge Brown. That filibuster was led by a guy named Joe Biden. It also included people like Chuck Schumer. It included Pat Leahy, included Dianne Feinstein. The reason they filibustered Judge Janice Rogers Brown is because she was a black woman, but she was also conservative. And they did not want her to go to the Supreme Court. And they succeeded in filibustering her. They delayed her nomination for a couple of years until it finally went through. She finally went to the D.C. Circuit. Now, everyone who was harumphing in the media that if you oppose an African-American woman who's a qualified judge, you're a racist, precisely 0 of them thought it was racist for Democrats, including Joe Biden, to filibuster Janice Rogers Brown. By the way, there was another nominee that Bush put forward, a guy named Miguel Estrada. Miguel is an incredibly qualified Supreme Court advocate. He was nominated to the D.C. Circuit as well. The Democrats filibustered him. If you read the memos that were leaked from Ted Kennedy's lawyers, here's what Ted Kennedy's lawyers said about Miguel Estrada. They said, "We must stop him, quote, because he is Hispanic." That's what Ted Kennedy's lawyers said in writing. Now, I'm going to suggest to you, if you oppose somebody because of their race, that is the definition of racist. And look, I'll point out in your question, you said that my questioning of Judge Jackson was you used the term racist. Listen, racism is a horrific evil in this country. It is also an insult that the left tosses around casually. I would welcome, if you look at the questions I asked Judge Jackson, every single question I asked her concerned her record. Either her record as a judge, sentencing defendants before her, or her record writing academic materials and law reviews, or her record giving speeches to law schools. All of that is the job of the Senate in the advice and consent process. And so respectfully, I could not disagree more deeply when you say it is racist to examine a judge based on their record. If the Democrats wanted to oppose Janice Rogers Brown because they oppose conservatives, you know, do you think the Democrats were all sexist when they voted party line against Amy Coney Barrett? I'm willing to bet you don't, because she's not a liberal woman. So you can't have it both ways, which is that when a Democratic nominee has a certain characteristic, anyone who opposes them is racist or sexist or what have you. But when a Republican nominee has those characteristics, it's open season and you can go after them full force, and the left is righteous in doing so. The standard should be the same, and I'm going to suggest what the standard should be, is we should examine people based on their actual record and whether and to what extent that record demonstrates.
The moment started with an accusation that instantly changed the energy in the room. A student stood before Senator Ted Cruz and claimed his questioning of Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson had been flagrantly racist. Not unfair, not overly aggressive, racist. And in today's political climate, that word carries weight. Because once someone gets labeled racist publicly, the expectation is usually simple: defend yourself, apologize, or get emotional. But Cruz didn't do any of that. Instead, he thanked the student for asking what he called a substantive question. Calm tone, no anger, no interruption. And honestly, that probably caught people off guard immediately. Because rather than rejecting the accusation outright, Cruz first praised Justice Jackson. He called her bright, accomplished, talented. He said her personal story was inspiring and acknowledged the historic significance of seeing an African-American woman on the Supreme Court. That matters because it completely disrupted the narrative being built in the room. The accusation implied hostility toward Jackson herself, but Cruz reframed the issue completely. He argued his questions weren't about race at all. They were about record, her rulings, her speeches, her judicial philosophy, and whether senators have a constitutional responsibility to examine that before approving a lifetime appointment to the nation's highest court. Then came the part that shifted the conversation entirely. Cruz brought up Clarence Thomas, and whether people agree with him politically or not, this was the moment where the argument got uncomfortable, because Cruz asked a difficult question. If criticizing a black Supreme Court justice is automatically racist, then what explains decades of attacks against Clarence Thomas? Thomas has faced some of the harshest criticism of any justice in modern history, and Cruz argued much of that treatment wasn't simply about legal disagreements. He suggested race in modern politics often gets filtered through ideology. In other words, if a minority figure agrees politically with the left, they're celebrated. If they disagree, suddenly the attacks become far more personal. Then Cruz took the argument even further. He brought up Janice Rogers Brown. Back in the George W. Bush era, Brown, a black conservative judge, was nominated to the D.C. Circuit Court. Democrats blocked the nomination for years. According to Cruz, many of the same voices now insisting opposition to a black nominee equals racism had no issue opposing Brown. His point wasn't necessarily criticism itself is wrong. His point was consistency. Do the same standards apply to everyone, or only when politics align? And then came another example, Miguel Estrada, a Hispanic conservative judicial nominee who Democrats aggressively opposed. Cruz even referenced claims that leaked political strategy documents emphasized stopping Estrada, partly because of concerns over his background and future political influence. By this point, the conversation had moved far beyond the original accusation, because suddenly, the issue wasn't Ted Cruz. It was something bigger: how political labels get used in public debate, and whether accusations like racism are being used to end conversations before they even begin. Now, to be fair, critics of Cruz would argue tough questioning can still carry implications people find troubling. Supporters would say scrutiny is literally the Senate's job. That's the disagreement. But what made this moment stand out wasn't shouting. It wasn't outrage. It was how calm the response stayed. The expectation seemed to be confrontation. Instead, Cruz responded with examples, history, and argument. No raised voice, no viral meltdown. And that may be exactly why this exchange spread so quickly. Because regardless of where someone stands politically, people noticed the contrast. One side delivered the accusation, the other side challenged the premise. And in an era where political conversations often collapse into insults before they even begin, that alone made people stop and watch.